Tim Goodrich, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
It's good to have you on today. And, in fact, I think you said you were at an anti-war event earlier today, right?
Yes, I was. We had members of Veterans for Peace, Iraq Veterans Against the War, and Code Pink ladies out in front of a private residence. We were across the street, actually, because Hillary Clinton was coming to town.
Oh,
and
really?
Having a fundraising luncheon at $25,000 per plate.
All right, well, hang tight. We got to take this break real quick, and we'll be right back, everybody, with the Iraq Veterans Against the War. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. Sorry about the rough start there. I wrote down the wrong phone number for Paul, the producer, so we had a little bit of trouble getting Jimmy Massey, but we got him on the phone now, right? Can you hear me, Jimmy?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, now let's give you both the introduction you deserve. You're both founding members of the Iraq Veterans Against the War. And I guess really I'll let you introduce yourselves. Perhaps you can give us your background and tell us where you were stationed in the run-up to war and that kind of thing. Let's start with you, Jimmy.
Yeah, I spent 12 years in the Marine Corps. During that time, I was primarily an infantryman. Then I became an instructor at the Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island, teaching recruits infantry skills, repelling, gas chamber, that sort of thing. And then I volunteered to become a recruiter. I spent 3 years as a recruiter in western North Carolina, my hometown area. And shortly after my tour of recruiting, I was sent to the front lines of Iraq from January of 2003. I left the country May 15th of 2003. I was discharged honorably December 31st of 2003.
Okay, and Tim, you were in the United States Air Force, correct?
That's right. I enlisted in 1999 because my family has a long military family tradition. And also I wanted to serve my country. I thought it was an honorable thing to do. And during that time, my first deployment to the Middle East was in support of Southern Watch, patrolling the no-fly zones over Iraq. The second one was for Afghanistan, and the third one was the intensified bombing of Iraq 6 months prior to the war, while Bush was still back here saying he was going to try diplomacy first.
Now, Jimmy, you were a career guy. You joined the military when?
In 1992, shortly after the first Gulf War.
Okay, so if you had stayed in the military a little bit longer, you would have been able to get your retirement and such, right?
Yes, I had 8 more years to get my retirement.
Okay, and now I want to be clear on ranks here. Jimmy, you were a staff sergeant, right?
Yes, an E6.
And Tim Goodrich?
I was a senior airman, which is an E4.
Okay. And now, Tim, you were stationed on an AWACS, right?
Right. Well, that was the aircraft I was working on, the E-3 AWACS, which is a command and control aircraft. Basically, it directs the fighters and the bombers where to go to drop their munitions, and it's just a big airborne control platform.
That's the one that looks like a regular jumbo jet, but it's got the giant radar dish on top, right?
Right, it's got that big, we would call it an M&M. We've got a big giant dish on the top of it.
Right, so for people, we've all seen that on TV. We know what we're talking about there. And now, because of your position involved with the airborne control during the bombing of the no-fly zones, and then, as you say, later in the actual invasion, this is where you got to learn, Tim, that the war actually started before we were told it did, and as you just said, before or during the time that the politicians were still telling us that they were doing everything they could to solve the Iraq crisis, such as it was, diplomatically.
That's right. I was over there in the fall of 2002, August through October, and meanwhile, Bush and his administration were back here at home trying to give different reasons and rationales to go to war in Iraq, trying to prove that they were right. And of course, we all know that we ended up going to war, but during the time I was over there, the bombing increased to the tune of approximately 500% from what we were previously doing.
Really?
And Bush was back here saying we're going to try diplomacy, and he hadn't gone to the UN yet. He still hadn't gone to Congress yet. I saw the lies firsthand.
Okay, now, he went to the Congress on October 2nd, 2002, is when they passed their resolution, and then the United Nations passed Resolution 1441 on November 8th, 2002. So you're talking about this escalation of bombing on the order of 500% increase was before he even went to the Congress for the authorization to use force.
That's right. During the run-up to the fall of 2002, the whole rest of the month in 2002, the bombing was an average of about 10 tons per month. And all of a sudden, starting September and even as far back as August, the bombing jumped up to about 50-plus tons of bombs dropped over Iraq per month.
Wow. And now, again, this is in the fall of 2002, before the war. Now, what did they tell you that you were doing? I mean, beyond just the average patrols of the no-fly zones, what was the explanation for the difference here?
Well, back then, being in the military, you don't have the whole picture in front of you. And oftentimes when you're fighting on the front lines of a war, you know less about what's going on in front of you than the people do back home reading the newspaper because they can see the bigger view. But one thing that I definitely knew is that the ops tempo had increased. We were doing a lot more missions, and I could tell that things were escalating. And September 5th in particular was an important day because that was the day that the United States and the United Kingdom together, the coalition that was over there, they launched an airstrike that included over 100 different jets.
And now, was this covered in the press at all at the time, or this was above top secret kind of thing?
It was covered in the press, but very minimally.
I do remember a little bit of coverage in the run-up to war. I don't know about the 100-jet thing, which we can get back to that in a second, but there was a little bit of coverage of increased bombings in the no-fly zones. We're going to go ahead and try to bomb as many radar stations as we can to go ahead and soften them up, because after all, we're probably going to war anyway, right?
Well, that's right. Thing. There are actually two different reasons that worked out well for the U.S. to do this bombing beforehand. One, bombing over Iraq tried to goad Saddam into war and give the U.S. a reason to retaliate, basically a reason to start the war. And Saddam was a pretty smart guy. We can't dispute that. He may not have been a very pleasant guy to be around, or we'll go as far as to call him a tyrant, which he was. But the fact is that he was smart and he realized what the U.S. was doing, and he didn't retaliate, didn't give the U.S. that reason to go to war.
This is what they called in the Downing Street memo Option B, the running start, right? Try to provoke a casus belli.
Right, casus belli, that's exactly right. And the secondary effect that this had that was positive for the United States and the United Kingdom was that since Saddam didn't retaliate, we were still able to deteriorate the air defenses over Iraq, partly because the rules of engagement changed, whereas before under Operation Southern Watch and under the United Nations, the only targets that could be attacked were targets that pose an imminent threat, which means is if these radar installations or surface-to-air missile sites locked on to the U.S. and U.K. fighters and bombers. Well, but like I said, those rules of engagement changed during this period, and all of a sudden we were bombing command and control centers and telecommunication centers that did pose no imminent threat.
In trying to provoke a response, the Iraqis had not been able to shoot down a single plane over the no-fly zone in 12 years. So were they trying to deliberately, were they forcing the planes to fly so low that they would be more likely to get shot down or something?
Oh, I don't know about all that. I wasn't a pilot, so I can't really comment on that.
It seems like a hard way to provoke a casus belli when even when he's trying to shoot missiles at our planes, he hadn't been able to hit one in 12 years.
That's right, and also it's because Saddam's military was crumbling around them, partly because of the sanctions, and they had a bunch of outdated equipment that the U.S. was able to counter.
Okay, now this massive operation on September 5th, this is the one that Jeremy Scahill wrote about in The Nation, right?
I believe that's the one.
Okay, can you tell me about that? You said 100 jets?
Right, 100 fighters, mostly launched out of Kuwait, launched an attack over southern Iraq and took out many different targets.
And this was just in one night?
This was just one night, 100 different coalition aircraft.
And now, I'm trying to get a handle on how much of an aberration that was when you say that they had already kind of ratcheted up from, on average, 10 tons to 50 tons worth of ordnance a month, I think you said. How much more was this particular night, this bigger operation?
Well, I don't have the exact figures for that night, but September 5th was part of that escalation, and it was part of those figures that shot up to 50-plus tons for the month of September.
Can you tell me what percentage or even a rough estimate of what percentage of the bombs that were dropped on Iraq were actually laser or satellite guided? In the media here at home, particularly right during the start of the war, they made it seem as though nearly every bomb that we dropped was a satellite-guided bomb and that every possible precaution was being taken to protect innocent civilian lives and that sort of thing. Right.
Well, back in Gulf War I, the figures that the government was stating was that 10 to 20% of the bombs were laser-guided. We call them JDAMs, Joint Direct Attack Munitions, guided by GPS satellites. And then with this current war, they quoted that 80 to 90% of the bombs being dropped were these smart bombs. However, even during the period of UN sanctions and the southern no-fly zones, there were a lot of innocent casualties. I can quote you from the United Nations airstrike report from December of 98 until halfway through 1999, more than 100 civilians were killed and injured as well because of these coalition airstrikes.
In fact, I think there was a report that came out sometime in 2003 that said, oh, yeah, about all that, yeah, we kind of exaggerated the percent of precision bombs. And actually, there's a lot of just plain old dumb bombs falling out of the bottom of B-52s and that kind of thing as well.
Right, there's no way to tell exact numbers. Basically, a lot of times with stuff like that, you just have to go on what the administration tells you. And also, there's a lot of classified stuff, too. So it's going to be a long time before we get the full accurate picture.
Right. All right, everybody. This is the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with two, although you might not know it. We'll get right back with Jimmy Massey, Sergeant from the Marine Corps, and also Tim Goodrich from the U.S. Air Force. They're from Iraq Veterans Against the War. Stay tuned. My friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. The website is weekendinterviewshow.com. I keep all the archives for you there in MP3 format. Also, you can find me writing occasionally and on the blog at antiwar.com. I'm talking with Jimmy Massey and Tim Goodrich from Iraq Veterans Against the War. The website is ivaw.net. That's ivaw.net, Iraq Veterans Against the War. And Jimmy Massey, I've actually both of these gentlemen I've had the chance to meet before up at Camp Casey during the protest against George Bush near his Crawford Ranch in August. And I've had a chance to talk with Jimmy before, and in fact, I've even written about it on the Anti-War blog, if anybody wants to look that up. And it's a pretty serious story you have to tell, Jimmy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your role in the invasion of Iraq to start?
Sure. We went in country around March 20th. Our first town that we went into was the town of Safwan. I was really expecting pretty much, a third world country, destitute, poverty. And what I saw was actually kind of the reverse. People coming out and greeting us and treating us like liberators, bringing us food and bread. So I didn't even see any combat or witness any combat until about halfway to Baghdad, and it was a very brief firefight that we had gotten into. I did see a lot of the destruction, primarily from the bombing campaigns from the air raids. A lot of death and destruction on that part, and civilian cars were bombed out as well. And we actually went into an area called the Rashid military complex, and the Iraqis had taken a tractor-trailer bed and converted it into a morgue, which was full of bodies. When we asked why, they said it was from the bombing that had taken place during the invasion. But I started to become very critical about the war when we were involved in shooting innocent civilians at Marine Corps checkpoints. I had to question whether or not what we were doing was a violation of Geneva Conventions, rules of combat, international law. And, over the 3-month time period that I was there, we had 30-plus innocent civilians casualties at these checkpoints. So I became very outspoken and was asked to resign my position while I was in country. And at that time, I was having nightmares and staying awake constantly and not being able to get a good night's rest. So I requested to talk to a psychiatrist while I was in country. They diagnosed me with depression. They sent me back stateside, and when I got back stateside, when I went to go see the psychologist, they ordered me into the hospital. I was automatically diagnosed with depression and conscientious objector. So when they tried to label me a conscientious objector, I hired an attorney. If it wasn't for the attorney, that I would have been thrown in jail because they were trying to label me as a CEO. And
why would you have to go to jail for being a conscientious objector?
Well, it's a violation of your contract. I mean, with me having 12 years experience in, they could say, conduct unbecoming, a whole bunch of wide variety of different charges, as well as a CEO. So,
and from what I read, you basically told them, okay, you can call me a conscientious objector for objecting to the killing of civilians. I'll see you in court, pal. And they decided that they would rather not push it, huh?
Correct. So I was honorably discharged December 31st of 2003. And I've been speaking out against the war and brutality that's been imposed on the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people saw the brutality of the American forces very early on in the war at places like Abu Ghraib and at these checkpoints. So I feel that the escalation of the violence or the rise of the insurgency is because of the brutality that the Iraqi people witnessed.
It seems, if you read a lot about the initial invasion, in fact, I've even interviewed very hard left-wing reporters here who were in Iraq who said, hey, there's just no denying it. The fact of the matter is many people in Iraq were very glad to be invaded and to have the Ba'athist dictatorship overthrown. And it's often described that there was this window of opportunity where the people of Iraq were sort of saying, well, we're not sure if we trust your motives, but you say you're here to liberate us, so let's see how it goes. And I guess I wonder, Jimmy, how long do you think that window of opportunity lasted before, as you say, the checkpoints and the different kinds of brutality against civilians in Iraq probably shut that window for good?
Well, it's really simple. I'm a country boy from North Carolina. I'm about to explain to you that window of opportunity. There's a passage in the Quran in this speech, your enemies come to you.
Real quick here.
Yeah, you'll treat them with dignity and respect until your enemies do something to counter that. Then they become your enemies.
Yeah, so it didn't take too long. All right, everybody, we'll be right back with the Iraq Veterans Against the War. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Tim Goodrich and Jimmy Massey from Iraq Veterans Against the War. Tim Goodrich, a veteran of the U.S. Air Force, and Jimmy Massey, a former staff sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps. Now, Jimmy, you've actually just written a new book called Kill, Kill, Kill. From what I've read, it's only being published in France right now. Are we going to be able to get copies here in America anytime soon?
I don't know.
Could you not find an American publisher?
I went through many American publishing companies, and they were all afraid of liability, slander lawsuits, because I do name names. That's...
Well, don't they have fact checkers and lawyers for those things to make sure that you're telling the truth before they publish it?
Well, they do. But, it ultimately goes up to the board of the publishing company, and then they sit down and
I want people in the audience to think about this for a second now. An American veteran who just got back from going over there to fight for freedom has to get his book published in France. Let that sink in for a minute. Explain that to your kid, people in the audience out there, what that means. That this soldier has to get his story published in Europe. I'll be lucky maybe if I can get a translation on the internet later. In the land of the free. That's great. Okay, now let's get back to serious here. There's a very famous picture from the Iraq War, Jimmy, of a little girl covered in her parents' blood from them being shot at a checkpoint. And I believe I've seen this picture around so many places. I think this is going to end up being the one that sticks in the American psyche like the naked little girl from Vietnam running down the road. You told me before when we talked at Camp Casey that there was one particular experience at a checkpoint where you just said, that's it, I've had it with this. What happened?
Yeah, it was near the Baghdad Stadium. We were told to set up a checkpoint, and this red Kia Spectre had come speeding out from the highway entrance and came towards our checkpoint. We signaled the vehicle to stop. It did not. We discharged our weapons into the vehicle. There were 4 men in the car. 3 of them were hit and were expiring. The driver of the car was not hit, and he immediately got out and he started asking my Marines, why did we shoot, that they weren't terrorists. And we did search the car and we found no weapons. But come later to find out that one of the occupants that had been hit expired, and it was the driver's brother. So he questioned me as to why we had shot his brother. That was the point when I had to make a conscious decision, because I knew that we were violating the Geneva Conventions as well as international law. I had to make a decision whether I was in or out, and I decided that I was out.
You told me also that you were asked to shoot kids who had thrown rocks at you and your guys.
Well, that had particularly happened that did happen in country. Marines aiming for guys that are on their bicycles, just having malicious type of humor. But when you're exposed to that type of environment and that type of brutality, and when you're exposed to the horrors of war, it can really make you do things that you normally wouldn't do. So I don't hold these Marines accountable for their actions. War is hell. What I do hold them accountable for is the fact that we did commit, war crimes and violating international law and Geneva Convention. So, but I think this obligation goes all the way up to the top, not only just with the Marines, but the Marines were being used in a pawn for the military-industrial complex. So I think that this violation goes all the way up to the top with the president.
Well, you're absolutely onto something there about individual responsibility. I mean, after all, Jimmy, you're proof that a soldier can say, no, you know what, I'm not going to participate in this war, and quit. And so the soldiers who are still there and continuing to do their jobs and not doing what you did, they are responsible for what they do. However, it really has to be emphasized that it always comes down to blaming the soldier on the ground and not the politicians. You look at Abu Ghraib, for example, where Seymour Hersh wrote a whole book explaining the chain of command, Copper Green, the secret access program. This is how to torture people to soften them up for our interrogations, and they blame it all on a couple of bad apples from Appalachia.
Right. Well, I mean, let's look at Lindy England, perfect example. Our military-industrial complex has run so deep, it's even into our judicial system. You can't tell me that this just lone female committed all these heinous acts without the command not having knowledge. Everything that we did came down from higher intelligence. The intelligence reports that painted the average Iraqi as a potential terrorist came from higher command. We were basically given carte blanche to shoot first and ask questions later. But all of this came from higher intelligence. So I think that this bad apple goes all the way up to the top, starting with congressmen, senators, and the Bush administration as a whole. They allowed this to happen, to manifest.
Yeah, ordered it to happen.
Yeah, I'd like to point something out, too, real fast. 90% of state and federal law enforcement are ex-military. We look at what happened down in New Orleans with all these state, federal law enforcement watching this man being beat. We have converted into a military-industrial complex society. We are, our brutality runs down to the poorest person.
We're going to have to get back to Tim Goodrich and a little bit of, I want to know really about y'all's activism and that kind of thing. But, Jimmy, let me ask you briefly here about the post-traumatic stress disorder. We talked about when we met before at Camp Casey how if you fill out your psych test questionnaire in Iraq and say, yes, I'm having nightmares and this and that, then they'll really take care of you pretty well, you said, the Veterans Administration. Sure. But if you fill out your psych test in Iraq and say, oh, I'm okay, and you don't come down with your symptoms until you get home, then they say, oh, tough, you're faking it because you already told us that you're A-okay.
Exactly. And it's just a tool to manipulate the young men into saying, there's nothing wrong with me. But what happens is then they start taking it out on their loved ones. We've already seen reported cases of soldiers coming home, abusing their wives, sometimes even murdering them. So, this type of news is being kept in and around the Marine Corps bases, which I feel, should go globally and show what's truly happening to these soldiers when they're returning home as far as psychologically. They're covering it up, and what we're going to have is basically an epidemic years to come, because PTSD can manifest itself in as little as 6 days or 30 years. We're going to have an entire generation that's been exposed to PTSD, regardless of what you did while you were in Iraq. I feel that anyone could manifest PTSD, from a nurse to a combat infantryman. But this is going to plague my generation for years to come, this trauma.
What is shell shock like, Jimmy?
Every day it's a challenge. I look at things completely different than I used to. I don't have enjoyment with things that I used to, constant. When I go to bed at night, I worry about having nightmares. Because the nightmares affect my day throughout the day. So then I have flashbacks, when I'm awake during the day. And but I've learned techniques through the VA to help realize the signs and symptoms and being able to recognize it and dealing with it right then and there. But every day is a new challenge, and you learn how to live with it and accept it, and go about with your therapy to help yourself to heal.
I feel I got to mention here. I learned this from George Carlin when I was a kid. That in World War I it was called shell shock. In World War II it was called operational exhaustion. And World War II it was battle fatigue. And then in Korea it was operational exhaustion. And now it's post-traumatic stress disorder. And as George Carlin said, if we still called it shell shock, people might actually understand, because the words hurt. The words have force. But when you call it post-traumatic stress disorder, now all the pain is buried under jargon. And it becomes a thing where, it's in the media. DOD admits 30% of returning veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder. And people go, well, okay. And then as you say, Jimmy, if they didn't have it before they left Iraq, as far as the VA is concerned, they don't have it now.
Yes. That's correct.
So what do you guys do for each other? I mean, there's got to be, you guys must have set up some sort of support system for fellow guys going through the same kind of trauma as you.
Yeah, we set up a support system called Vets for Vets. It's basically based on the same principles as a 12-step program. The except it's therapy 101 or within a group. And, we go around and we ask everybody, basically how they're feeling and give, each individual's time to speak and talk about what's going on in their lives. So, this is one way that we've incorporated, trying to heal the wounds that the war leaves that aren't visible sometimes.
And if there's any veterans in the audience right now who would like to contact you, how would they go about doing that?
Well, the best way that they can get a hold is through ivaw.net. There's a website on there for filling out the application form, or if they would like to have a specific speaker come to speak in their community, there's contact information on there to get a hold of the main office. So we have different programs, and another one is counter recruiting, getting into the local high schools and telling them, what it's like to be a veteran exposed to combat or maybe possibly PTSD. These are things that the recruiter doesn't tell them. So, and
because you were a recruiter, right?
That's correct. Yes.
And so I'm sorry. Tell me a little bit more about this counter recruiting. You go out to high schools and tell the kids, "Hey, don't believe them," or?
No. I just tell them the things that I did while I was on recruiting. Telling applicants to lie on their application, possibly about a medical situation, or lie about their drug abuse. And also, I had the power to call up the district attorney and make things disappear on a criminal record check. So. Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, there's different. That's when I talk about the military-industrial complex. It's really running that deep. It's in our children now. The No Child Left Behind Act just gave total, complete access to recruiters into the files with your children. Everything from their SAT score to date of birth to Social Security number, they have full access to. So, we go in and explain to them. A lot of them don't know what military-industrial complex means and how our society is based upon this and how we feed off of corporations such as Halliburton and Boeing and Lockheed Martin, and explain to them why there's no jobs in America, because they've all went overseas to China and to Mexico.
One of your fellow IVAW members, David Lewis, who I met while up at Camp Casey, he reminded me of Rothbard's term, the warfare welfare state, the military-industrial complex, as you call it, our whole society turning that way. David Lewis told me, I really want to get out. I can't sign a conscientious objector packet and try to get out that way because they've already loaned me all this money for college, and I'm scared I'll have to pay it all back. So now here he is at Camp Casey protesting against the war, and yet still may go back to Iraq to kill people and get killed.
Yeah, it's funny. I've got friends in Canada and Japan and France, and I always ask them, I say, how is your health care system? How's your college system? And after they explain to me how the state pays for the medical and pays for them to go to college, they start explaining to me, I'm like, how come our country doesn't do that? Oh,
they do. You just have to join the military first, right?
Exactly. Well, you got to learn to kill first before you're given anything in America. But it just goes to show how brutal America really is and how we raise our young. You must kill in order for you to achieve your goals in life. That's pretty sick.
Indeed. All right. Now, Tim Goodrich, U.S. Air Force veteran, really quickly before the break here, I want to bring up an article that you wrote with Representative Lynn Woolsey in June called Bring Home the Troops. And in that article, you said that the invasion of Iraq is, quote, the best recruiting tool Al-Qaeda's ever had. And I wonder if I can get, quickly the IVAW's position on exit strategy. Is it for just absolute immediate withdrawal and consequences be damned, or what do you say?
Well, just in the interest of accuracy, Scott, that was actually released over Memorial Day weekend, and it appeared in various newspapers throughout the country, and it received wide circulation.
I see.
The IVAW standpoint, we have three main goals that we wish to accomplish. first is to bring the troops home now. Second is to support them once they get home. And third is to support Iraqi reconstruction in whatever way possible. The sooner we realize that the occupation is part of the problem and not the solution, the better off we'll be. And a lot of people ask, well, isn't it going to go into civil war over in Iraq? The truth is we don't really know what's going to happen in Iraq when we pull out, but we do know what's going to happen if we continue to stay there, which is just this ever-continuing, increasing cycle of violence and more soldier deaths and more civilian deaths.
Now, when you say support the troops, what exactly does that mean to you, Tim?
Well, support the troops, I can tell you what it definitely doesn't mean. It doesn't mean slap a yellow magnet, a yellow ribbon on your car and drive around with that on there saying that you support the troops, because that's not real support for the troops. Real support for the troops, the best way to support them is to bring them home, of course, bring them home alive so they can be back safe and sound with their families. But also, we need to realize that they're going to have a multitude of problems once they arrive home, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're going to have financial difficulties transitioning back into civilian lifestyle. We need to support them those ways also.
All right, everybody, we're talking with two Iraq veterans against the war, Jimmy Massey and Tim Goodrich. Their website is ivaw.net, and we'll be right back to wrap up. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with former Staff Sergeant in the Marine Corps, Jimmy Massey, witness to atrocities against civilians in Iraq, and former Air Force, I'm sorry, I forgot your rank, Tim, Tim Goodrich, also from Iraq Veterans Against the War, both founding members. He's a witness to the early start of the war in the fall, late summer and fall of 2002. And I suppose we can wrap up the last few minutes here. Tim, we started off, although you didn't really get a chance to tell me about your protest earlier today against Hillary Clinton. And so I want to know about that, and then maybe if you can tell the audience sort of in a broader scope what Iraq Veterans Against the War is up to and what kinds of activism you guys do and how they can contact you and all that great stuff.
Well, just a few days ago, we found out Hillary Clinton was scheduled to visit here in Hollywood in Los Angeles at a private residence, $25,000 per plate fundraiser luncheon. So realizing after taking a look at her voting record that she is an ardent war supporter, just as bad as many of the Republicans, in fact, we thought it was appropriate to go and make our presence known and let her know that we're not happy about this representation. So we went across the street from this residence, and there were probably a good 50, 60 people out there, which isn't too bad for 24 hours notice once we finally got the information all together and put out there. And when her entourage came up, we made sure that she heard us, and all the guests walking up, they received pamphlets that outlined Hillary's real voting record, just to make them aware that she doesn't really stand for the people like a lot of people think she does. And this is happening all across America. Our elected officials are not representing the will of the people. Especially out here in California, we've got Senator Feinstein, and her voting record is just as bad as Hillary Clinton's. She's voted yes on continued funding for the war all along. And she's not taken a stance against the war whatsoever, despite California and New York, in regards to Hillary Clinton, being arguably the most liberal states in the country. Now, we all know that more than 60% of the people in the United States as a whole want the troops to come home and don't agree with the war. So here in New York and California, where that percentage is even higher, we need to have our elected officials representing the will of the people, and we're not going to stop until they do that.
I'm looking at some pictures from the big protest September 24th through 26th in Washington, D.C., and I watched as much coverage as I could on TV, and I have to say I didn't see you guys anywhere. Did you guys show up for that?
Oh, we are there, and we were there in force. At the beginning of the week, we had a number of people that we thought we were going to have there, and then by the time the march actually happened, that number was double. And part of that was because we had active duty people even flying in from Colorado, driving up from Florida. We met them out on the streets. People that had recently left the military and driven up from Georgia and all over the U.S. People were coming out of the woodwork because they didn't agree with the war.
And, of course, I'm being facetious because I read the press, and I know that you guys had at least 50 people there, and I did see some pictures. But, again, it's worth pointing out, along the lines, again, of Jimmy having to get his book published in France, you guys weren't on TV. Sorry, but the TV producers apparently don't want to see guys in camouflage marching against the war. I want to thank you both so much for your time today. I'm sorry we didn't get to get back to you, Jimmy. I still got some more questions here, but I really appreciate you guys very much. Everybody look up Iraq Veterans Against the War at ivaw.net.
Thank you, Scott. And if I could real quick, we need donations to keep getting our message out there.
Yeah, you hear that, folks? Go to IVAW and donate. It's a very powerful group. Thanks again to you, Jimmy.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back, folks.